Hello everyone, here's Michael Schindhelm speaking. I hope that you can hear me. And I want to welcome you to the second online meeting with me. The Contemporary Chinese Art Award as a case study of global culture is our subject. In the meantime, we have reached the third week of our course. So you may have learned already quite a bit about Uli Sigg's collection and activities as a Chinese contemporary art collecting, Chinese contemporary art creating networks, finally launching an award as a tool to create a network to identify talents, finally also to promote these talents in both China and in the West. First of all, I would like to thank you for your participation so far. I can see that online a lot of people have comments in their journal, raise questions. We try hard to answer those questions where needed and possible. I myself also run a kind of journal with some aspects reflecting the topics of our weekly chapters, but at the same time also some of your debates and discussions. And I just want to invite you to also get in touch with myself, but also, of course, with Barbara Roof, Julie Pütz, who are the instructors in this course, and therefore in many ways also very helpful in keeping the communication up and running, including, of course, also Renato Soldenhoff, who is also today the co-organizer of that meeting. In case that something happens, he may also appear on screen, or at least as his voice, his master's voice, because then he would be the guy to fix the problem. So we have around 45 minutes maximum this afternoon. I mean, I'm speaking about afternoon Central European time, summertime. I'm actually not in Central Europe, I'm in London currently, but here is afternoon too. Wherever you are, great to be in touch with you again. I want to invite you now to answer, to put questions, to ask questions. You know how to do this. It would be great to hear what you want to know from myself in the next minutes. There is one question I would like to start with because it has been asked already a few days ago, and I think it's a very important question, and it also raised some discussion already. Therefore, it's certainly useful to discuss again. It's Jezreel Kaimor, if I pronounce it more or less acceptable, and she may even be online also today. She raised the question some 4 or 5 days ago, how can we appreciate art when it is being prohibited in one's country? It's a very valid point. Certainly, in particular, if you speak about a country like China, you may be aware of the fact that currently the country's public situation has even become more complicated. Authorities have tightened up public communication in many ways, silenced critics, have also shut down websites. Again, in particular, if those websites have addressed current issues of the Chinese government. However, at the same time, you can see a booming art scene. You can see that many artists, not only visual artists, but also filmmakers, writers, and others are on display in China and abroad. And I think not everybody may like what they do and what they say, but in the meantime, there's a pretty complex and diverse picture of expressions of Chinese artistic expressions in the public domain, both in China and also worldwide, which shows that obviously art cannot be prevented from being seen, being heard, being appreciated in both China and the West. Of course, for us in Western countries, it's much easier, usually, as long as the content has arrived in the public domain outside of China. But also in China itself, there are, of course, ways and channels to exchange content, if not everything, so at least a part of it. However, I agree, and you may remember I'm coming from East Germany and studied in the Soviet Union, so I have quite some experience of almost 30 years under a communist rule and therefore in an unfree society. And I can confirm that there are procedures, there are regulations tightening public communication and making art very difficult to be exchanged within a society. And these procedures and regulations are often pretty similar from country to country, and even from, let's say, one generation of authorities, officials, governments to the other. And when Uli Sigg in the mid of the 90s started seriously discovering, researching the art scene in Beijing and Shanghai and also in other cities in China, he had certainly to face the fact that it was not easy for him to get in touch with artists. And I do think that one of the major problems he had to face was that he jeopardized not only his own situation as in the beginning a manager and later as a diplomat, but also the fate of the artists themselves, who were officially never allowed to mingle with foreigners and maybe even to sell artwork to them. So only when he became the ambassador to China in 1995 and enjoyed a certain autonomy and sovereignty in his own actions in China, he was able to communicate with Chinese artists more free. And that allowed him to visit many of them in their studios, discuss with them their artwork, show them also sometimes artwork in catalogs or otherwise from Western countries, because at that time many Chinese artists were not able yet to travel abroad and therefore were also disconnected from the art scene in Western countries. So Uli Sigg was in this regard somebody who was a messenger almost between the Western art scene and China, the Chinese art scene. And then there was this very instrumental point when he created this award and suddenly enabled people to refer to a postal address in Beijing and say, I'm an artist living here or there in China, and I'm doing this or that artwork already for quite some time, and I want to participate in this competition to becoming maybe the most important, the best artist selected by the jury of the CCAA in this year. And within a very short period of time, Uli Sigg suddenly created an enormous knowledge about where artists lived, what kind of artwork they did, how they felt, how they sustained, how they communicated among each others. And then he brought in curators from China and from mostly important institutions of Western countries, like, for example, the Biennale in Venice, like the Tate Modern later, like the Serpentine Gallery, or the Documenta in Kassel. So that was an enormously smart move in order to suddenly discover what's going on in China and to appreciate art, although at that time it was still pretty much prohibited. So another question I got in the meantime is how art reflects society. I think again, it's related somehow to what I was talking just now about, because as art is a sensor of social changes and social developments and social conditions. I think when a country is particularly free or enables art to express freely, then this is shown in the artwork. And you usually can enjoy an enormous variety of expressions. But at the same time, you feel also that art is not necessarily something extremely existential. Art may also be just something to entertain people, or maybe to offer possibilities for investments, etc. In a society where art is not free, you see that art struggles. Art is a tool to address issues, social issues, political issues, cultural issues, maybe even religious issues. And therefore, art becomes a means to communicate between people who share concerns, who share those issues, who want to address them. And very often, art is a more flexible, a more subtle, a more intangible means than, for example, media, which are usually controlled by the state. Art is something developed by individuals, work by small collectives, and therefore it's much more flexible in its expression and much more difficult, finally, also to control. Another question here is, what is the role of the traditional Chinese art in the development of Chinese contemporary art? How are they intertwined? Was traditional art also completely prohibited in Mao times? This is asked by Julien. As far as one can say today, there was indeed no serious art activity possible, including traditional art, actually already since the end or the beginning of the Mao times. There was a very severe control on many of these things during the 50s. Of course, it took the communist authorities quite some time to get a grip on all artists throughout the country. That's why maybe over the first decade or so, after 49 and in 1949, Communist China had been founded. So after, let's say, during the first 10 years or so, it might have been easier yet for also traditional artists to still conduct their work, but it became more and more complicated. And of course, the Cultural Revolution was meant to abandon the cultural traditions of the past in particular. So they were targeted in particular. So ink painting, calligraphy, landscape painting, the most traditional pillars of contemporary art in China were abandoned, and people who conducted this were usually forced to stop and very often unable to even reconnect to their work after the end of the Cultural Revolution, either because many of them had lost their skills, or they were already dead or old. So you can see that China suffered for a long time from the results of the Cultural Revolution and from the destruction which came along with this period. Even more so because what happened afterwards was a kind of extraordinary, as we talked about last time already, economic change in the country, triggering shifts in the countryside. Many people wanted suddenly to live in cities. An enormous process of migration happened. The urbanization itself became the driving force of the making of a new society in China. And as a result, most of these traditional aspects of Chinese life were abandoned even more. So it took probably a few more decades before contemporary traditional Chinese art was rediscovered. And that brings me to the first question of Julien. I think on the one hand, over time, let's say maybe since the late 90s, the younger generation of today, let's say people being 50, 60 years old, recovered from this enormous pressure and destruction, and were able to regain their skills, to distribute also their arts, and to make it very popular again. And in the beginning, you could see that suddenly traditional Chinese art became extremely attractive again. Much earlier than contemporary Chinese art, traditional art became attractive again. And when the art market in China suddenly established itself and galleries were flourishing, they were in the beginning not necessarily selling so often contemporary art, but rather traditional art. And buyers, collectors, in particular Chinese buyers and collectors, collected in the beginning, first and foremost, traditional art. And the prices were suddenly skyrocketing, not only on fairs and auctions in China itself, but also abroad, because, as you know, Chinese money is available today in many parts of the world, and therefore traditional art was on display and on sale almost everywhere. And some of these traditional artists were still living, were on the top list of bestsellers of art worldwide. And only over time, contemporary art became in China also very attractive. It starts to compete. However, the most expensive artists in China are still some of the traditional artists. At some point, younger generations, younger people, and artists of contemporary art discovered traditional art as well. And Uli Sigg himself was keen to show this transformation in two major exhibitions he was conducting, one in Lucerne, which traveled to also other cities, and the second one in Hamburg, a few years ago. Hamburg was actually only in 2014. The first exhibition in Lucerne was about landscape, one of the major pillars of traditional art, and how contemporary artists reflect on landscape art today. So he was commissioning some young artists of today to create artwork which would reflect somehow the traditional landscape painting. A second exhibition was dedicated to calligraphy, where he invited a large number of artists from three different generations, Chinese artists, to sort of relate to the tradition of calligraphy. This was an enormously powerful and interesting exhibition, showing an enormous variety of different expressions, from total rejection to irony, but also to a very serious, in-depth analysis and maybe even discovery or rediscovery of calligraphy among artists who had never done this type of art before. So you can see that in the meantime, there is no such thing anymore like a deep gap, but there is, at least from the contemporary art side, a very strong interest also in traditional art in China today. Another question asked by François Quier: among the different controversial issues like politics and economics, history, religion, sexuality, law and order, environment, which one is the most sensitive in China? Oh, that's of course a difficult one, given the fact that I'm not really a political scientist, and this is a question for political scientists. However, I try to give you some hints here. First of all, I think many of the issues you have addressed here are interrelated. So they have to do with each other. You cannot really completely separate economics from politics. To just give you one example, you cannot separate environmental issues from politics. And I think indeed that over the last 10, 15, 20 years or so, you could observe an enormous rise of awareness in the Chinese society over certain issues. One of the most important one is probably pollution. And as we could see in the recent past, whenever artists, but also just regular, so-called regular people, address those issues in a powerful way, like, for example, in a YouTube video, which was screened a bit more than a year ago for a short period of time, showing a disastrous form of air pollution in major cities in China, where you couldn't almost see anything due to an enormous haze development. It was seen by, I think, several 100 million people in China and abroad. And then it was shut down. So it was a very, you could see that in particular, modern media and modern technology has enabled people, not only artists, but everyone, to address those issues. And to some extent also reach the public domain with your concerns, and to exchange. If you look at the public domain in China today, or on Chinese subjects, you would see that environment is certainly one of the most, the deepest concerns many people in China share. I have shot a film about Uli Sigg's life, which had been released recently only. And in this process, I was talking to many Chinese artists of several generations. And you could see that the younger generation, the people who are in the meantime, let's say between 25 and 40, address issues like globalization, the disappearance of cultural differences, but also the challenge of the disappearance of traditional customs and habits, and finally environmental issues, the same way like young people in the Western world do so. So in other words, what you can see is that if you look back in history, 20 years ago, there was an enormous gap of awareness between Chinese people and Western people, because they simply lived in different worlds. They had not very much to share. Today, due to globalization and due to the fact that China was catching up so fast, due to urbanization, due to economical development, due to political power, but also due to cultural exchange, due to traveling, due to consuming art and culture in a similar way, and due to, like Western people do, and due to being part of a global community of internet users, the young generation of Chinese people behaves and perceives and assesses the reality of today in a very similar way like people do in the West. And that's a very interesting point, shows that China and the Chinese people have really become global players and have really become contemporaries of us in a very different way from the generation before, let's say my generation. And I think the government in China has to face this fact that the younger generation in particular is much more knowledgeable about the rest of the world, is much more knowledgeable also about the problems China has to face itself, and therefore they address these issues also. I think pollution is one of those issues, urbanization is another one, but there are certainly many more. There's another question, sorry. Renato is asking, were art and activism always related to each other? Yeah, I would say certainly not. This one of the issues I had addressed already in my previous answer. I do think that with the rise of modern technology, in particular social media, internet, it has become much more easy for people who raise political concerns and social concerns to share those concerns with others. And in particular, in countries where, let's say, traditional media are failing to transmit expressions, transmit let's say, political content in a free way, in an individual way, those means of modern technology have become instrumental in replacing traditional media. So I think since also in China today, let's say, means like social media have become extremely important and sometimes used even much more than in Western countries, it shows that people are extremely keen to exchange among themselves about things. And of course, also a lot of very personal things, but also about political things, about social things. So that artists relate to this in one or the other ways is not surprising. And very often, artists use today those media also in order to come across with their messages and to reach out to much larger audiences than they would be able to reach if they would be still regular artists only. And I remember I shot 10 years ago a film about the making of the Olympic Games Stadium Bird's Nest in Beijing. That was a long-term documentary between 2003 and 2008. And I was very close at that time to our web and to the Swiss architect Serge Demron, who had invited me to create this documentary. And during this time, I could see how Ai Weiwei has changed his opinion on China, his home country. In the very beginning, he was still somebody who was critical about the country, but at the same time, supporting the two architects in creating a stadium which was supposed to become the stage where also the official China wanted to show to the world how they see themselves in the beginning of the 21st century, with the opening and the course of the Olympic Games 2008. In the end of the film, in 2007 and 2008, Ai Weiwei had turned into a very harsh critique of the country. He even said at some point in the film, I give a damn on this stadium. I will never go there. I will never go to the opening. I don't want to associate myself with anything related to it. What had happened? Many things have happened. First of all, he had started his blog, which became extremely popular at that time, where he started addressing many political and social issues. What had happened too was, you may remember, there was this earthquake in Sichuan, in the province of Sichuan, where many people were killed, among them also very many children, and the government had also restricted information about what really had happened, so that some people until today are not really clear how their relatives, how their children have been killed. So Ai Weiwei went to the province of Sichuan with other artists and started making his own research and publishing what he had found out in comparison to what had been released officially by the government. And he got in trouble with the authorities, local authorities, first in Sichuan, and later, as you know, also with the federal government in Beijing. So the former exclusive, let's say, critical artist had turned into an activist over just a few years. So this is what happened at that time with somebody like Ai Weiwei, who is today known as both an artist and an activist, but probably in, let's say, a wider range of our also Western society as an activist. And I think he is an example for many artists who at some point found that due to modern media, and Ai Weiwei became not only a very powerful blogger, but also he was using Instagram, as you probably know, he's still using Instagram intensely for disseminating his messages. And many people in the West and in China follow him. And it's very difficult for the government to shut this down. And he's only one among many of these artists. And therefore, I would say today, in particular, due to the fact that there are issues to be addressed in China, which are really severe, and at the same time, there is modern technology allowing to disseminate messages this way, that art and activism are often joined. Next question. Do you see a kind of resignation regarding Chinese artists seeing their country, especially the 2000s, where the Chinese contemporary art was just being rediscovered. Barbara is asking. Okay, I would say yes and no. It depends on who you would look at. For example, I would say there's a very strong difference between generations. The people who are older, who went through already very, very critical and nasty things during the Cultural Revolution, maybe sometimes even before, of course, are much more critical about this new economical power China has gained, and also the nationalism which is on the rise in China since, let's say, for the last 10 years or so. So that's why I would say the older generation is, generally speaking, pretty critical. However, there are, of course, also, there's another notion, and this is that contemporary Chinese art has become extremely successful, business-wise successful tool to make money. So that's why artists who were still very poor, in particular of the middle generation, the people who are now 50 plus, many of them have become rich while they were also critical. So you can see that China has become an affluent society where art is something which make many people sustain, even if they are to some extent critical. So that's why, interestingly, political criticism and economic success are not necessarily exclusive, mutually exclusive. It is possible to be both at the same time. The young generation is probably a bit more complex, because there are on the one hand those who are successful and maybe also very unpolitical and just ride the waves of the new fashion. At the same time, you can see, as I mentioned before, that there are people concerned about pollution, about education, about healthcare, about many, many basic things which they think don't function the way they should in the country, and in particular young people addressing this. Renato, when and how happened the breakthrough for Chinese artists in the West? I would say, indeed, this is related to our subject in particular, because I wouldn't say there was a single moment. There were certainly various moments, and in a vast space of cultural production like China, it's impossible to identify one single moment and one single person being responsible for all what happened in the aftermath. But however, I would say Uli Sigg and his creation of the CCAA award was certainly particularly instrumental. Why? As I said earlier already, and I want to share with you, if you haven't seen this yet, two of our researchers who worked with us on the on this course, they created at some point 3 networks, and I would like to share with you these 3 networks. These networks show the development of the CCAA since its foundation in 1998. Here you see it. I don't want to go too much into details now, because you can look them up again also in your documents. These 3 networks are published also in the PDF documents you can find on the website. I just want to refer quickly again to it, because it is sort of related to the answer of the question I want to deliver here. So you see the CCAA's rather scarce network in 1998. You see an enormously much more complex network in 2008. And if you look into the details, you would find that whereas here there were just a very few institutions and mostly individuals involved, but individuals with an enormous power, like, for example, Harald Seemann, who was at that time also the director of the Venice Biennale. It grew into something where suddenly a lot of institutions in both China and the rest of the world were involved, like institutions of universities, the Tate Modern, the Documenta in Kassel, the Berkeley Museum, the Shanghai Art Gallery, on the other hand, etc. So you see that there is a mix of individuals, of commercial institutions like galleries, of museums, of universities, of biennales, etc., who in one or the other way get involved. And just 4 years later, it looks again much, much more complex. If you would try to draw a similar kind of network today, it would be probably in the meantime pretty difficult to achieve this. So this is what I wanted to show you, because the CCAA enabled Uli Sigg and the people he had invited to participate in getting an enormous knowledge about what's going on in China and connect this with the rest of the world in this business. So a major step was to every year when he conducted this ceremony or conducted the research on the best artists of Chinese contemporary art, he invited curators or other experts of Western art and a few people available on Chinese art and brought them together in a jury. And there were a lot of debates among these people, and it was probably the first time that Chinese intellectuals and art curators of that kind of profile would be able to freely debate about what is quality in art, what are the major movements and trends, how they differentiate themselves from similar type of movements and trends in the West. When they would debate this with their colleagues from London, from New York, Berlin, Kassel, Venice, etc. And that's why this award was so important, because it was for a long time almost the only platform of that kind where experts from both ends were able to convene and to discuss and to agree or disagree on quality in the contemporary Chinese art scene. And not only this, but in doing so, in particular Western curators were able to invite these artists also to their shows. So there's no surprise that, for example, Chris Dercon, who was the director of Tate Modern, at some point, and he was in the beginning still the director of the Haus der Kunst in Munich, that he invited an artist like Ai Weiwei. He used to know through the CCAA. He invited Ai Weiwei in 2008 for the first time to have a big solo show in Munich. And Ai Weiwei, by the way, used this possibility of addressing his harsh criticism against the Sichuan earthquake handling by the government, by creating the facade, turning school suitcases of children which had died during the earthquake. So that, you may remember, was the first time that Ai Weiwei became extremely visible in the West, in Western media. And shortly before, he was in Documenta in Kassel, and again the director of the Documenta was part of the jury of the CCAA before and had met Ai Weiwei this way and invited him to the Documenta. Later, Chris Dercon invited Ai Weiwei to the Tate Modern after he had moved from Munich to London. And this is only one example where curators have identified a very powerful Chinese artist and brought him to the West. And I could bring up here other examples too. In particular, I want to mention, if you haven't seen this yet, that Harald Seemann was the first president of the jury of the CCAA in the late 90s, at the time when he was also the director of the Venice Biennale. And at that time, China still had no own national pavilion at the Biennale. And therefore, after having seen a lot of art in China, thanks to Uli Sigg's support to come to China, to travel with him to China and get introduced to Chinese artists, he opened the Arsenale at the Biennale in Venice for contemporary Chinese art and put on display, I think, 23 artists, and triggered an enormous interest in Western institution, media, and among collectors and curators immediately. So therefore, I would say, in many ways, that was yeah, a very good, a very strong tool to make contemporary Chinese art also knowledgeable to the West. Okay, guys, I think I hear already that François tells me that he is pleased, hopefully, with my contribution. I think our time is more or less up. If you don't mind, I would like to finish my meeting with you today with mentioning that there will be 2 more, or most likely even 3 more online meetings during this course possible. And I would like to share with you quickly, if I'm able to do so. I wanted to share with you, and for whatever reason I'm not able to. It happened already the same way last time. Renato, are you still around?
So yeah, I'm around. Sorry, I just.
I don't know why it happens again, but last time already I lost the screenshot with the information about the next 2 webinars, the next 2 online meetings. Maybe you can help me out.
Okay, so I will also write it in the chat that everybody can see it. So we have
yeah, now I see it.
On the 12th of May at 2 p.m. Central European Summertime, and then we have in chapter 6 Kathleen Bühler. She's the curator of the exhibition Chinese Whispers in Bern, and she will be around on the 22nd of May at, I have to just to see it, at 5:30 Central European Summertime. And then maybe you have to tell the last meeting with you. We will plan another one.
Sure, sure. Okay, so to wrap it up, Uli Sigg, May 12th, you will anyway receive and see the announcement Julie will make later, closer to the date. On the May 12th, there will be an opportunity to connect directly to Uli Sigg. It would be great if you could join also this meeting. And on May 22, there will be an online meeting with Kathleen Bühler from the Kunstmuseum Bern, who was running, is still running the show of the Sigg Collection, Chinese Whispers in Bern. I will probably wrap it up in the very end of this course, which means in a good 3 weeks from now. Then we will get to see each other for the last time in this course. In the meantime, I wish you all the best with this material. I hope you enjoy the next 3 chapters, and otherwise I hope you enjoy this weekend and you will have a good time. Thank you very much so far for today. Bye-bye, everyone.